Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to the FCPA Compliance Report. This is a very special bonus presentation of the FCPA Compliance Report. In it, I post a podcast, which was the 100th anniversary episode on Mike Volkov's Corruption, Crime, and Compliance podcast site, where he interviewed me. So I thought I would ask Mike if I could cross-post it on my site, and he graciously agreed to do so. We talk about a wide variety of compliance issues. Of course, my love of Star Trek and trekking through compliance, where the Compliance Podcast Network is going, my perspectives on the DOJ and OFAC guidance, and of course the antitrust compliance guidance, where the 2012 FCPA resource guidance fits into all of this and how it still has use for the compliance practitioner, where compliance professionals need to prioritize over the next 5 years, and indeed where enforcement and compliance, including automation, blockchain, artificial intelligence, data analytics, and machine learning may be taking us. We look at the Trump presidency and the Department of Justice's commitment to FCPA enforcement and where it may be, going forward. It was a ton of fun, and it was also a fascinating exploration of kind of where we've been and where we're going. So I know you'll enjoy it. It was a lot of fun.
Welcome. This is Michael Volkov, and this is episode 100 of Corruption, Crime, and Compliance. And our episode today is an interview with Tom Fox. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today on Corruption, Crime, and Compliance. Before we get started, I wanted to ask everyone to subscribe to and give our podcast a 5-star rating so other compliance professionals can find the podcast. Well, since this is a milestone episode for me, 100 episodes or 2 years of podcasting behind me, I thought it appropriate to welcome back to the podcast my good friend and professional colleague, Tom Fox. Everyone in compliance knows, admires Tom, collaborates with Tom for all of his incredible work and commitment to compliance. First, Tom maintains the preeminent FCPA and compliance blog. Second, Tom has advanced his commitment in this area as the compliance evangelist or guru, creating and expanding his compliance podcast network, which offers compliance professionals a great variety of compliance podcasts. Many of them are must-have for every lawyer and compliance professional interested in compliance. I'm also proud to participate with Tom and the group on his Everything Compliance podcast. I also am just regularly subscribe to his podcast offerings, many of them, including I love the Daily Compliance podcast, the FCPA Week in Review with Jay Rosen, Compliance in the Weeds with Matt Kelly. The innovation one is really terrific. And Tom knows that because I tell him that all the time. But there are many others that are great. On a professional and personal level, I will say this: Tom has been a frequent advisor to me. He told me early on to get out of big law, commit to my blog, and start my own podcast, which was similar advice I got on get out of big law from Judge Stanley Sporkin, the grandfather of the FCPA, who told me to get out. And I followed their advice and have been a much happier lawyer ever since. So thank you, Tom, for that as well. And with that intro, Tom, thanks for spending time with us today and welcome. And thank you for celebrating the 100th episode.
Well, Michael, I'm truly honored to be here with you today. This has been a great podcast series that you have put on. You've really advanced the ball in not only podcasting for the compliance practitioner, but in thought leadership as well. Your professional background is different than certainly mine and many others in the compliance profession, with your government service, both in the Department of Justice and on Capitol Hill, your actual trial work. You're a lawyer who's been to trial, a trial lawyer who's been to trial, in an increasingly unfamiliar place for many trial lawyers. And then, of course, you work in compliance. So it's added. You've really added to the discussion and put together a package of perspectives that certainly I have found very useful, helpful, and fascinating.
Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. We also share a common love for the Marx Brothers, baseball, and even to compliance, but most importantly, the Marx Brothers. But I do, and we hopefully will have some chances in the future to collaborate in more podcast series. But let's start, though. I wanted your compliance podcast network seems to be growing exponentially. And I've seen you've had a lot of new additions. I also have to compliment you just on the trekking through compliance this summer, which I think has been terrific because it reminds me of some of the old Star Trek episodes, some of which I had even forgotten about, and just how cool they really were. But anyways, let's start with the Compliance Podcast Network, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about also the specific Star Trek project.
So, yes, thanks, Mike. I decided at the late last year to formalize the podcast I was doing literally into the Compliance Podcast Network. And the Compliance Podcast Network is just that. It's a podcast network dedicated to themes generally related to compliance, but it's a little bit broader than that. I'm trying to add 2 shows a month. So this month I added Creativity and Compliance, a podcast with Ronnie Feldman. Ronnie's well known in the compliance space in his learning and training videos, but he's also a professional comedian by background. So he's got a very different set of experiences than you and I, and he brings a very unique perspective. Next week, for instance, I premiere yet another podcast with Sam Silverstein. Sam was one of the keynote speakers at the ECI 2019 Impact Conference, and Sam talks about accountability. And he talks about it in a way that, frankly, I've not heard anyone else talk about. And Sam's message of accountability is absolutely essential and mandatory for the compliance practitioner. And so Sam and I are starting a podcast together, which will, as I said, premiere this next week. I've got upcoming podcasts that we're under production with Mike that we'll be rolling out in August. And we could tease a little bit. Mike and I are going to get together for a podcast where we're going to share our love of compliance and the Marx Brothers. And we're in production on that. So it's been a great journey, and I've gotten a lot of different voices in compliance. It all started really with Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine with the Great Women in Compliance series, and they have done just a fabulous job on that series. Jonathan Marks with his Forensically Speaking podcast has been a welcome addition. My own daughter, Paris Fox, has joined us with Modern Medium, where she brings a millennial's perspective to graphic arts design, art, and a wider variety of topics that the compliance practitioner should consider. So it's really been a lot of fun. I've really been able to get people to develop podcasts based on their own background and their own passions. And it's certainly something that I'm going to continue to grow. I recently joined C-Suite Radio, and C-Suite Radio, Mike, is one of the country's top business podcast platforms. And it's given me a even larger platform to talk about compliance. And I'm the voice of compliance for them. I have my own compliance corner with them, and it's been a real pleasure to work with them. They are much broader than simply compliance. As I said, they're one of the largest business podcasting platforms. So I'm going to have lots of guests from their other podcasts going forward. As you mentioned, one of my personal favorites is Innovation and Compliance. And I've been able to have a wide variety of innovators in products, innovators in services, innovators in ideas, innovators in thought leadership, and lots of ideas that are applicable to the compliance practitioner that you might not even think about, all the way from I met 2 guys who started up a online recording service that I use called Squadcast. Well, it turned out one of those guys was a former internal auditor, and he saw the need for a quality auditable podcast trail, amazingly enough. So it's just it's been an interesting exploration and trekking through compliance, though. That you're absolutely right. That is, I am a Star Trek original series aficionado, having watched the first episode when it was released in September 1966. I fell in love with it then. I'm still in love with it now. And the original series, of course, is 79 episodes. So it was a fixed term of shows. And since they're 90 days in the summer, I thought it would be appropriate to do it over the summer. I've had a ton of fun doing it. As I told my wife, we're going to have to rewatch every episode because this is, preparation for my podcast. And she rolled her eyes and perhaps rolls her eyes every night when we sit down to watch an episode or two. But I sure love it. And I've enjoyed rewatching them, thinking about the compliance and leadership perspectives, thinking about shows that were shown in the 60s and how different things are now. There were a couple of episodes that, frankly, Mike, had horrific rape scenes that I had not remembered.
Really?
And of course, they didn't show anything, but that was a clear import. There was one where Captain Kirk attacked Janice Rand, Yeoman Rand, and her telling of that story was just gut-wrenching in terms of thinking about the Me Too era and even Jeffrey Weinstein. I just watched and posted today Patterns of Force, where that was the one where they found a planet which had emulated Nazi Germany. And if
I remember that.
Yeah, if that's not prescient to today, I really don't know what is. And then A Private Little War, which is about Vietnam and the escalation of force, I thought was equally applicable to today. So I really enjoyed that series. It's really been a lot of fun. They're short, 7 to 8 minutes, a story synopsis, a fun fact or two, and then the compliance or leadership lessons learned. So if you haven't checked it out, please check it out. I'm also, Mike, extraordinarily pleased to be a part of Sarah Haddon's new effort as the publisher of Corporate Compliance Insights. I cross-post my entire catalog of podcasts from the Compliance Podcast Network on her site. And so that's given me another, I think Sarah has 25 or 30,000 daily subscribers. So it's yet another platform. I post now on 12 separate platforms. So I have the widest reach there is. There's a way for you to download or listen to my podcast. Some of the platforms I post on are iTunes, Megaphone, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google, and a wide variety of others. So if you're having trouble finding me, just let me know because I can surely point you in the right direction. And it's really been just a ton of fun for me to do it. People enjoy talking about their passion and their profession, just as you and I do. And I tell people when I interview them, it's a virtual cup of coffee with Tom. What do you do and why do you love it? And everybody enjoys talking about that.
Well, it's been terrific. I have to commend you. I forgot about I have listened to the Women in Compliance, and that is terrific. Mary Shirley, and then you had on people that I know from the Houston area. But also, Tom, just take a moment, and I want to promote this because the Greater Houston Business Ethics Roundtable, I think, is perhaps one of the best models for, let's say, a local compliance group. And I know you serve as the president on that. And can you just give us a feel for that in terms of what you're doing there? Because I think that's a really good model for other cities or other regions of compliance officers who want to try to get together and share ideas.
Sure. The Greater Houston Business and Ethics Roundtable, or GERBER, is the most senior local compliance and ethics organization in the United States. Of course, there are other large professional organizations, ECI, Ethisphere, et cetera. There are also business and ethics schools at universities and colleges that have been around. But this is a local organization in the greater Houston area dedicated to compliance and ethics. It's open to all who want to participate in that discussion. It was founded 22 years ago now by Dr. Betty Steed, and what she saw was a need for discussion around business ethics based upon something you referenced, Mike, which was the 1992 U.S. Sentencing Guidelines. And in 1995, she founded our organization. It's been around since that time. We bring local business and compliance and ethics professionals together for symposia. You recently spoke at our members only workshop. We have quarterly meetings. We have social events. And probably the thing I'm most proud of, Mike, is, and frankly, the thing that drew me to Gerber was the following. We give away 5 scholarships annually to local graduate students in business schools in Houston area universities around business and ethics. So universities submit applicants, and we make 5 selections. That's been going on at least I joined, I think, in '08. So it's been going on at least since then. We've given away hundreds of thousands of dollars in scholarship because we thought, and the founders and other presidents before me thought it was important that we invest in the next generation of business and compliance and ethics professionals in our city. And we've done that, and we continue to do that. We recently had our annual award, which we give out each year. This year it went to Jim Deloach. Jim is at Protiviti, and Jim is literally one of the country's leading experts on internal controls. And his internal controls around Sarbanes-Oxley, around ethics and compliance, and that discussion, he's an author of numerous books, articles. He is perhaps the most gracious gentleman I have met in the compliance realm, and he was well-deserved of the award. But Jonathan Marks gave a fabulous keynote speech there. Jim's thoughts about his professional life and the challenges that he has faced, which are numerous, from a disability from childhood that he has overcome to achieve what he has done, were just awe-inspiring. And it's a great organization, and it's designed, as you said, for the local folks. And if there's anyone out there that's would like to talk to me about it, I'm certainly happy to do it. We're not affiliated with any other organization. You can have a local organization that's self-funded, self-fulfilling, and keep going. So it's been a great ride for me. I've been an officer now for, I guess, 5 years. I've been the speaker chair, and I've got in the middle of a 2-year term as president. And it's really a great organization. You've spoken several times. You're extraordinarily well received when you do come to talk here, as are really all of the speakers. So we're looking forward to a continued run, and it's been a great professional opportunity for me. But once again, the educational component of Gerber cannot be underestimated.
Well, it's interesting because I just think Houston is a great, for whatever reason, how it's become a leader in compliance, but the ideas and the programs that are in Houston, obviously with oil and gas there just has been great thought leadership that's come out of there. And I always tell people that I spent a lot of time early on in my compliance career down there. And I learned by going to a lot of conferences and meeting people down there. There used to be more oil and gas conferences when oil was at $100 a barrel, and I just found it incredible, the passion, the talent of people in Houston. And it's interesting because you see people from Houston sort of spread out. Eventually, they get an offer to leave Houston, to become, let's say, a chief compliance officer somewhere. And you see Houston's influence everywhere in the compliance profession. It's really incredible. So, let's go to some compliance issues now, Tom. And obviously the biggest issue has been all the guidance that has come out from the Justice Department, now from OFAC. And, there's been a lot of commentary about it and the value of it. Does it set a new standard? Is it a minimum? Is it a maximum? What is the value of the guidance that's come out? And I wanted to sort of get your perspective on, from the compliance professional, what do you see compliance people doing with this? And, are there any pitfalls that you see in using the guidance? I don't see any downside, but I don't know what your perspective is.
So, Mike, I see absolutely no downside, frankly, ever by ingesting anything the Department of Justice criminal division says, or the fraud section says, or the FCPA unit says into your compliance program. And I always, let me emphasize, always welcome their public commentary. So the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs 2019 guidance was one more piece of information. And whether you want to go back to the sentencing guidelines, whether you want to look at the deferred prosecution agreements, the Morford memo, any of the memos that came out in the last decade, whether you look at the opinion releases, whether you move forward to the 2012 FCPA resource, whether you look at the pronouncements by Leslie Caldwell when she was with the department, which led to the 2016 pilot program. We have the 2017 evaluation of corporate compliance programs, which was released, leading to the 2017 FCPA corporate enforcement policy announced by Rod Rosenstein, and then a couple of amendments or changes or modifications to that corporate enforcement policy over the past now 18 months. A couple announced by Brian Benczkowski. We, of course, had the Benczkowski memo from October 2018. Lots of information has come out, and the 2019 guidance is part of that guidance that should be considered by the compliance practitioner. You have written really articulately and passionately, Mike, about the OFAC guidance. And so I've really leaned on my interpretation of the OFAC guidance, in large part based upon what you've said. But the thing that struck me the most about the OFAC compliance framework guidance for the anti-corruption compliance practitioner is OFAC's focus on non-sales side third parties. So in the FCPA world, or the anti-corruption compliance practitioners world, we take a look at third parties on the sales side of things. But OFAC has a little bit different focus and certainly a broader remit. And they said you need to focus on your customer base. You need to focus on your vendor base. You need to focus on third parties who are involved with your organization that are not on the sales side. And I believe you were at the presentation that Bob Ward made at the Gerber 2019 workshop, where he said the three most important things in OFAC or export control compliance are the following: screen, and then screen some more. Right. And that's a message that I think the anti-corruption compliance practitioner needs to take to heart. We saw several bribery schemes in reported FCPA cases, really starting with Petrobras, where the customer was in on the bribery scheme, not the individual foreign government official or state-owned enterprise employee, but the customer itself was in on the bribery scheme. And that's a different quality of bribery than bags of cash across the border to pay off somebody to get a contract. And how does the anti-corruption compliance practitioner or the chief compliance officer sitting in Houston, Texas, sitting in San Diego, California, or anywhere else in the United States, how do they evaluate whether or not a contract has mechanisms built into it they're going to self-fund a bribe? It's extraordinarily difficult. So you've got to have the processes in place. You've got to have not only policies and procedures to help detect those sorts of things and prevent them, but then you have to have internal controls, safeguards, that when a red flag does pop up, its information gets to the compliance function, and the compliance function can then investigate, audit, or do an appropriate step, perhaps leading to remediation. But the bribery schemes have become more sophisticated. The bad guys know what they're doing. They know who's watching, and they know how companies are watching them. So they're moving to utilization of actual contract pricing mechanisms to self-fund bribes, as opposed to stealing it from the corporation, whether that be fraudulent expense accounts, calling it marketing expenses, calling it a charitable donation. So as compliance,
let me fire another one at you.
Schemes become more sophisticated.
One of the things that we've been speaking about with both the Benczkowski memo on how monitors work and taking a look at the 2019
you need to look at your vendors.
Updated evaluation guidance
customers.
is
this
when
is
we take a look at
have they ever done anything
outcome
wrong?
that we've had
this
now,
is an analysis
they're still
of a
applying a monitor
by
for 2 years. And
analysis,
Benczkowski
just as
says
you would have to do
in his writings that you don't really want to have
just as Bob
a monitor
has to do every day,
put on the matter if the company has spent money to self-remediate, if they're moving forward. But then in this case, we see that a monitor, after the company did not come to the government first, but did moderately cooperate. They did give information. They did work in their compliance program. So to bring in Louis Free to be the monitor for 2 years, even with a very narrow and scope focus, once again, does that comment upon the lack of the company's responsiveness?
Yeah, I agree completely.
Is the government client really concerned that companies still spent $1 million, but they want to get an independent resource to confirm that the program is currently working.
Is now in your supply chain, and I'm hearing more and more about supply chain audits where vendors are coming and demanding audits of various aspects of your program, is sourcing. Now where do you source your raw materials from? And OFAC is now concerned about, are you sourcing your materials that, let's say, may have originated in Iran or may have originated in North Korea or Cuba or wherever, or from a prohibited person? And I have to say that in all candor, people were not, looking at their supply chain in that way. So now that's opened up a whole new area. And for anti-corruption purposes, they're not in a representational type role, so we weren't spending as much time. We were doing reputational type screening. But now OFAC has raised the game in terms of your supply chain. And I know, by the way, Houston also has that, very popular yearly supply chain conference. But I would think this would be something that they should take a look at as a big risk in the supply chain area.
Mike, you're absolutely right. And that's a great example of the following. Supply chain compliance began with companies trying to understand who was in their supply chain because they wanted to look at the quality of supplies they were getting. Were the products meeting minimum standards for manufacture? So it really began as a business requirement in the supply chain that evolved to things like conflicts minerals and other areas where the government began to become concerned on where a product came from, separate and apart from the safety or quality issues. That put supply chains on notice, and that they had to then make a further inquiry to understand where their raw materials and base products were coming from. So that the supply chain compliance professional is, Mike, in many ways much more well suited to take on these new inquiries that OFAC and indeed the Department of Justice are mandating to know who you are doing business with. And it's different perhaps than our type of compliance, the anti-corruption compliance, because our compliance was largely led by the government enforcing the FCPA in the last decade and requiring companies to put compliance programs in place as a response to not only a legal requirement, but then enforcement actions based upon violations of that law. Whereas in the supply chain compliance professional grew up. It actually began in the environmental movement, where companies wanted to know whether they were putting products in, or raw materials rather, into their products, which would either harm humans or damage the environment. So they came about compliance in a little bit different perspective. You could even say, well, certainly it was a business perspective, but it was perhaps even broader or a little bit different than a business perspective. Whereas when you and I talk FCPA or anti-corruption compliance, we really talk about in the last decade where the government was leading the discussion on what constituted a best practice compliance program through the various pronouncements, really up to April of this year when Brian Bichkowski announced the 2019 guidance. So whereas in anti-corruption compliance, the government has led the discussion in many ways, in supply chain compliance, it's been the companies that have led the discussion, and they, I think, are well informed to, or well suited, I should say, to lead or inform the anti-corruption compliance practitioner in how do you look at your supply chain? How do you know what's in your supply chain, who's in your supply chain, what they're supplying to you, and where did it come from?
And I think this has been, this has been even underscored even more with the slavery problem, human trafficking, in terms of what do you have in your supply chain in terms of, maybe legal liability, but at least severe reputational risks. And you have the California Transparency Act, and we have the Slavery Act over in the UK. And so I think this raises, all of this is coming together, and maybe I think what we're going to see is sort of a new push on the supply chain side, because we've spent so much time on the distribution side, for FCPA purposes, that we may be coming full circle back to the supply chain and all the risks that occur there. But hey, one other point, Tom, just to give our listeners a little bit of news, you and I talked recently. I still love and still consider probably the best resource, the FCPA guidance from 2012. And it's amazing how you can read it and it still applies today in terms of valuable lessons there. First off, what do you see? Does it still have value to the compliance professional? And what do you expect to see down the road with regard to the guidance? The FCPA guidance.
I absolutely agree with you. It was just a fabulous resource in 2012, and it's a fabulous resource now. And let me mention the cost in 2012, and then now let me mention the cost now, free, at no charge, released by the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The reason it was so significant in 2012 initially was it was a compendium of all things FCPA up until that point. So it gave us the law. It gave us key enforcement actions. It gave us key opinion releases. It gave us hypotheticals based upon cases, based upon opinion releases, and based upon some declinations that we were unaware of that the department had issued prior to that time. Having the FCPA annotated in one place was a great resource.
Right.
And then, of course, it articulated formally the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, which has become really the universal standard by which compliance programs are measured across the globe. And with enough detail, yet written broadly enough that allowed a compliance practitioner or literally a layman to read it, understand what it required or suggested, and then the flexibility to put such a program in place for your organization based upon your risks. So it was a fabulous resource then. The 10 hallmarks still stand up today. Obviously, there have been more enforcement actions. There have been more opinion releases. There have been a plethora of declinations since that time that are not in the 2012 guidance. So if the government chose to update it, that would be a welcome addition. And then the updates, upgrades, and increases in sophistication and compliance programs since that time, I think would be a welcome addition as well. Certainly, if we looked at the 2019 guidance, we would, at least I would focus on a couple of different areas that were not talked about as much in 2012. And one is culture. The Department of Justice has recognized that it's really all about culture, starting at the top all the way down. But how do you measure it? How do you assess it? How do you improve it? How do you use culture to prevent a violation? How do you use culture to detect a violation? So culture is key. And then now with the 2017 evaluation, we had the first public announcement by the Department of Justice around the importance of root cause analysis. And root cause analysis has joined internal investigations, auditing, and other types of mechanisms by which a company can assess either a problem or a violation that's occurred, and equally importantly, determine what can be done to fix it or remediate it. And as the final step in the 2019 guidance, this document really mandated it's not simply looking at the problem. It's not simply finding out the problem. It's not simply doing ongoing monitoring on a continuous basis. It's how did you use that information to improve your compliance program? So what steps did you take to remedy deficiencies that may have come up in any of these investigative techniques that have been around for some time?
Well, that's absolutely true. I agree with you, Tom, in terms of what the importance of the root cause analysis, the culture, and all the other things. So Hey, I wanted to turn to another point, and that is, I mean, I am a big fan of your Innovation and Compliance podcast. It's something that I sort of regularly follow just to hear new ideas. And I also wanted to mention briefly, I think the NAVEX Global recent benchmarking definitive guide on compliance was really critical, because in it, what they found, and this it leads to my question, they found that the two most significant factors for effective compliance programs was senior management buy-in and nowadays automation. And so then that raises the technology issue. And we always hear about automation, blockchain, artificial intelligence, data analytics, machine learning. And there are a lot of great ideas out there. But I also wonder, for people who are just getting into automation or data analytics, how do you approach all the technologies that are out there? Blockchain is going to revolutionize compliance in my mind, particularly supply chain compliance as well. But what's available, what's cost effective for people who are in the trenches, and how do you approach that? So what's your sense of that, Tom? Because this is, to me, one of the biggest issues for compliance down the road here.
Sure, Mike. I absolutely agree. I think this is going to be the cutting edge of compliance going forward, certainly in the next 5 years and perhaps even beyond. It is what data is available to you, how can you access that data, how can you find the patterns and raked leaves, and then how can you deliver a compliance solution or remediation and or use that data on an ongoing continuous upgrade basis to upgrade your compliance program. If I would suggest a place to start is look inside your own organization. What information do you have that's available to you that you're not either accessing because it's siloed, you're not accessing because you don't have access to it, or you're not accessing because you don't know how to access it? If you can begin by identifying the types of information that are within your organization, part of that is through a gap analysis, looking at the internal controls you have in place, mapped up against the map your COSO-based internal controls against the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program. Would tell you any gaps, but it'll also tell you where your information is. And then from there, sort of take that information. So do you have access to your gift, travel, and entertainment spend as of your high-risk sales force? So I can't remember the first time I heard you say that gifts, travel, and entertainment are the lowest hanging FCPA fruit, but how many compliance practitioners have access to that across their organization, or at least with employees working in high-risk jurisdictions? Take a look at that. Analyze that information to see if there are any anomalies or unusual spends, and then move forward from there. But literally in a wide variety of other areas, we'll take a look at the internal information that's within your organization. So have you looked at the spend and the processes and procedures around your sales cycle? So a sales cycle is usually something along the following, Mike. You have a salesman who makes a call on a customer. They identify a customer. They identify an opportunity. That may lead to being put on the bid list. So once you're on the bid list, that means you get a request for proposal, and you respond to your request for proposal. If you are the successful bidder on that request for proposal, then you negotiate a contract. If you win that contract, or if you're successful, rather, in your negotiation, and you sign a contract and you begin to work for that customer, you have to manage that contract after it's signed. Well, each one of those steps has a compliance component. You have to look at your GTE spend at every step. You have to look at my comments earlier about when the customer's in on the bribery scheme. That's where looking at the contract price, the discount given, any rebates given. As a compliance practitioner, you may not have an appreciation of the value of a contract price, but you can bet your business guys do, and you can bet your EVP around sales does. So if there's a discount given, has it been approved by an appropriate level of management? That's not the compliance management. That's sales management, business development management. Then when you get to the contract, who are your third parties who are going to help you supply goods or services for this contract? Have they all been properly vetted? Have they gone through your both supply chain vetting and your compliance vetting? Have you used any agents in this process? If so, have they gone through the vetting? What's their commission rate? What's their percentage commission if they're on percentage? Are you using distributors? Once again, the same series of questions. That's just up to the point where the contract's signed. Now the contract's signed. And you have to manage it certainly from the commercial perspective, but you also have to manage it from the compliance perspective. Each one of the third parties I've mentioned, they have to be managed, and you have to manage your customer. What if your customer is a foreign government and they want to come to the United States to view your home office or your manufacturing facilities? Do you have a program in place that qualifies under the FCPA? So there's a large number of, and those are just data points that every company has. But my question for the compliance practitioner would be, do you have access to those data points? Do you have visibility into those data points? If not, how do you get visibility? Is there a technological solution or an automated platform that would give you visibility across those? My suspicion is that you probably got a contract management system in place from the business perspective. Do you have access to that? So there's a lot of information that you have within your organization and things you can do from a technological perspective, Mike, before we've even gotten to some of the more exotic things or cutting edge things that we can move to. But certainly getting a handle on what your company is doing and how it's doing it from the compliance perspective is absolutely mandatory going forward.
Oh, that is so true, because people they feel overwhelmed with the amount of data they have just within their company, and so what I think you're saying is to prioritize that look and try to get access to everything that you have. So well, Tom,
Mike, let me just say, these you don't have to reinvent the wheel. What I just articulated is called quote to cash. Every company has a quote-to-cash policy. Every company has a procure-to-pay policy on their supply chain side. Get out of your office, walk down the hall, and talk to the head of sales. Walk down to talk to the head of your supply chain. I guarantee you they have a process in place, and you should have visibility into that.
Absolutely. That's called what Donna Bohm calls line of sight, and you need to have visibility across the organization. So. Well, listen, this has been great. It's always great to talk to you, Tom. I have to leave. We have to leave with one last question, because I always ask this of you in terms of your perspective in the podcast network and all your writing and speaking and participation in the profession. But, how do you see things going right now for the compliance profession? Is it still a hot profession to you? And what do you see as the future and the challenges facing CCOs and compliance officers? I know that's a broad question, but just to take your temperature on what you see out there and where do you think things are going?
So, Mike, you and I have both been in this profession, I guess me since 2007, you're from around that same time. And it has been an incredible growth and maturation of the compliance profession since that time. All elements of the compliance profession have matured. The government's expectations have matured. Corporations have matured. Vendors have matured. Suppliers have matured. Customers have matured. And compliance, I think, now is properly seen as a business process. And as a business process, I think it's not only more important now for corporations, but it is more valuable for corporations. It's more important now because of the amplification of social media, whether it's companies protesting their employers who are selling mattresses to the detention camps on the border, or up to a Boeing with the problems they're having around the 737 MAX. Those are all compliance issues. And these 10 years ago, 12 years ago, this was not something you and I would have considered a compliance issue. So compliance has become even more important. It is a mandatory part of every business now, and have a compliance business process in place which will be able to respond quickly and efficiently to not violations of law, but areas that could cause a reputational hit. And that really leads to what I think is the most significant evolution or change in compliance now, which is that properly engaged, effective compliance makes corporations run more efficiently and more profitably. And so I'm going to start to talk about that and write about that and demonstrate that it's not that good compliance is good for business. It is that good compliance actually makes your business better and it makes you more profitable. And it turns out there are a lot of stories out there where companies have done just that, implemented a compliance solution, perhaps as a part of an FCPA settlement, perhaps as a part of a fraud risk analysis, perhaps as we mentioned earlier, as a part of a supply chain issue around sourcing. But that compliance solution actually made the process more efficient, and it made the company more money. It didn't just save the company money, it actually made them money. So when you start having that sort of discussion, compliance moves from a cost center to a business enhancer and business multiplier, and that's going to put more emphasis on compliance going forward. And the compliance practitioner is going to need frankly, another set of skills beyond what you and I learn in law school or what law schools are teaching simply about the rules and regulations of compliance, largely based on the FCPA. So it's an exciting time to be a compliance practitioner. The work that organizations like Gerber do in terms of donating money and for scholarships for business and ethics professionals, universities that are putting this forward not only as a way for academic study, but actually in academic teachings, I think are going to lead this discussion. And, I hate to sound like an old guy, but the up-and-coming generations that are moving into the workforce, the millennials and iGeners, they're demanding it. And they want to work for companies that do business ethically and in compliance. And if the company doesn't, when we saw the example of the Wayfarer mattresses all the way to Google, that they're not going to stand for it, and they're going to tell their employers, we don't want to work on this contract. We don't want to deliver this product. And when you have your employees saying that in a public way, you can bet your bottom dollar your stock price is going to take a hit.
Absolutely. Hear, hear. Well, Tom, it's been fascinating as always. I always get a lot of reaction we get a lot of listeners when you appear on the show, so I appreciate that. But if people, again, want to reach you, the best way to reach you, there's all your podcasts and whatnot, but the best way to directly reach you is what?
My email, tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Always happy to chat.
All right. Well, thanks, Tom. Thank you again. I appreciate all your support through the years, your great work, and just keep it up is all I can tell you. And thanks for everything you do.
My pleasure, Michael.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank Mike Volkov for allowing me to cross-post his 100th anniversary episode where he interviewed myself for his podcast, Corruption, Crime, and Compliance. If you have any questions of Mike, you can reach him in Volkov at the Volkov Law Group. Mike is also a panelist on Everything Compliance. And he and I will be starting a new podcast, Why a Duck. So look for that upcoming on all of the stations in which the Compliance Podcast Network pushes compliance podcasts out. This is Tom Fox. Thank you for listening to this bonus episode. I hope you will join me again Monday, where we have our regularly scheduled FCPA Compliance Report podcast. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio.